Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Technology Leaders podcast over at Celigo. I'm Jordan Tenenbaum, the social media manager at Celigo. I'm joined by our wonderful co-host, Mark Simon, who's the vice president of strategy over here. We have a very special guest, Chris Wayne, who is a director of engineering over at SUSE. Thrilled to have you here, Chris. Welcome to the podcast.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely, man. We're graced by your presence, so I'm happy about it. Well, let's dive right in. I think something that probably a lot of people want to know, especially about folks who work at SUSE, because it is such a large, but not only large, important company, is what's your story? How'd you get to where you are? How'd you grow into this role at SUSE, and tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So let's see. It all starts actually at Canonical, which is a different Linux company. So I went to Northeastern University that does kind of a co-op program where they help you find a job, and then you alternate 6 months of work and school. And so I did my last 2 co-ops at Canonical and then just didn't leave for 13 years. So it's actually interesting. I started off as a QA guy. So I have a very deep QA background, kind of built that up at Canonical over the years. By the time I had left, I was actually leading the QA and certification teams. So anything devices with Ubuntu had to go through me. And then how I ended up at SUSE was, I got a recruiter note on LinkedIn, and it was just kind of time. I wanted to try something completely new. It was very much a challenge of, like, hey, do you want to go from the devices side of the house to Kubernetes? I thought, that sounds fun. Let's try. And so, yeah, I started over June 2021. So I've been there a couple years now. Started off as the senior engineering manager for K3S and RK2 teams, which are our 2 next generation Kubernetes distributions. And then I think sometime around May, I was promoted to director, taking care of K3S RK2 and RKU1, which is our, I don't want to say legacy, but it's our original Kubernetes distribution, and trying to kind of coalesce that and lead the team that does Rancher Manager provisioning of those distributions as well. So
That's awesome, man. Congrats on the promotion, by the way.
Thank you.
And I think for those listening, those watching, they might not have ever heard of SUSE. Hopefully they have. But if you had to explain SUSE in, I don't know, 2-3 sentences, just to keep it simple for them, what would you say? Like, what does SUSE do, and what problems does it? You can use more than 3 sentences if you want. But what does SUSE do, and what problems does it solve on the whole for its customers?
So the main core of SUSE is enterprise Linux. It's basically supporting Linux on everything. We have Edge, we have telco, we have data center, and it's a lot of supporting that, maintaining stability, making sure that things that you want to work are going to work. So a couple of years ago, I think it was maybe 4 or 5 months before I joined, they actually acquired Rancher, and so we kind of got folded in as a separate business unit. So Rancher is basically, the easiest way to think of it is Rancher is kind of, we call it the enterprise container management business unit of SUSE. So that's kind of built up. And so now it's enterprise on the Linux side and on the Kubernetes side as well. And then we're also doing a big push into Edge, which is where K3S comes in, because it's a super itty bitty Kubernetes. So there's a lot of trying to pull that all together and, put out a full portfolio of enterprise grade products.
Fantastic. That's awesome to hear. Looks like Mark is brewing up a question. I can always tell.
Oh, kind of got my wheels turning, Chris, and especially because I think some of our audience is like, it's going to be a mix of technology leaders that are super familiar with some of these terms you just used and what SUSE brings to the market, and others like really completely unfamiliar with containerization and Kubernetes and Edge. And I'd love to go like, maybe take it from that perspective. How would you explain this to someone who's maybe not that familiar with these relatively modern infrastructure paradigms?
Yeah. So let's see. There is literally a little kid's book about Kubernetes that I bought my daughter that she can't read yet. It is somewhat tricky to like explain briefly, but so Kubernetes is container orchestration. It's the new hotness and has been for quite some time. Originally started at Google. Basically, it's a way to automatically scale up and down deployments of things. So you have basically web scale wherever you need it. So on the edge.
So if I can interrupt, let's even move up a level. You just mentioned containerization. What exactly is containerization in this connotation of use?
So
describe that.
Yeah, the way I like to explain it is it's basically building out a whole platform based on little bits, right? So it's little sandboxes, making sure that the easiest way that most people would think of it is Docker containers, right? You have an application that has all of its dependencies bundled in. It has everything that it needs. It's basically like, when somebody says, "Oh, it works on my machine," we just ship them the machine, right? So it has all the dependencies. It has the OS, the user space libraries that are needed by that application, and it basically allows you to break up some giant monolithic thing into a bunch of what are called microservices, right? And so then it allows you to iterate more quickly. You don't have to go through this whole process to update your app. You can update like just the part that does billing, for example, or just the part that calls out to some other microservice. And so it's kind of about turning things into smaller building blocks so that you can move quickly and have things talk to each other without having to go through a massive monolithic kind of environment, really.
I'm going to throw this out there. Two things. First, I have read the Kubernetes for Kids book, and it is way above my head. That is why I'm the social media manager here, not the Kubernetes manager. The second thing is, for those listening, and I'm going to break it down in social media manager terms. Let's pretend you have a modular phone. There's a screen, there's a processor, there's a microphone, there's a camera. Each one of those things do things on their own. That could be that's pretty plain and simple. You put all those together, you have a phone, which is essentially equal to an app that's in a container, if you will. That container or phone is part of a network that allows it to send and receive information. That could be the Kubernetes network. That's the easiest way that I could at least help our listeners understand it. For the non-technical folks, it is quite a challenging thing, but that's a great way to explain it the way you did, Chris. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. I want to kind of transition slightly. Something that we've talked about quite a bit in our podcast is AI. And I know that's kind of like a catch-all phrase at this point. But I'm curious, and again, I know SUSE is a big company, so this might not be exactly in your wheelhouse, but how does AI kind of play into containerization, into the Kubernetes distribution, K2s, K3s, the things that you're working on? And is that something that, in the future is going to be a big kind of necessary part of that infrastructure, if you will?
So there is definitely a lot going on with AI and Kubernetes for sure. There's places like Determined AI that have kind of a way to share multiple GPUs and kind of schedule things on them, and that runs pretty well on K3s. I happen to know the community manager actually worked at Rancher with me for a while, so that's why I know that. In terms of what my team would do, it's kind of outside of the scope in the sense that we just give you the distribution and then you can put whatever workload you want on it. Within SUSE and Rancher, we do have a team that's dedicated to AI and monitoring. It's basically using AI to try to improve observability and help find issues in your cluster, right? Like, oh, hey, this doesn't look right. We should alert you about it. So we do certainly have that as a focus in SUSE. I wish I could dive a little bit more into it, but it's a little bit outside of my team at the moment.
Totally fine. No, that's cool. It's just always interesting to see how various organizations are kind of incorporating it in different ways and whatnot.
Chris, one thing around some of these technical topics that I think is interesting is to kind of flip them around and look at like the business value of those and translate that, particularly for some of our audience, which could be more or less technical, more or less engineering oriented or hands-on or fairly removed. And maybe I'll kind of explain this by way of example. So I can remember in my prior life having one of the development teams reporting to me, and we made a movement. This was probably like 9 years ago. Started adopting Docker. And that literally transformed. So we're a small organization. I think at the time we were like 60 people or something total in the total company. So a boutique consulting firm. And we shifted to leveraging Docker internally for our own products and just really pretty much for everything we did. And I mean, my experience was that it was that alone, moving to containerization was like massively helpful and a game changer for what we did. Even having a small team, it made us dramatically more efficient. And from from a business standpoint, that was an example of a technology that changed a paradigm in a way, and that by leveraging that, I mean, it literally just made everything way simpler. Yeah. When you're developing custom applications and you're trying to get them tested and deployed to customers quickly and efficiently, and you're setting up, you have your own hosting environments and things like that. I mean, everything just got dramatically simpler. And so that to me really like made there's a very clear business value around containerization. And I'm curious, and this is a setup for the question, so bear with me. But really, the question then comes: if we take that a step further, and Kubernetes is really the modern evolution of containerization and that orchestration that you were talking about, how does that change the paradigm a step further, particularly for what we think of as maybe a mid-market company, not a massive multi-billion-dollar company doing things at huge scale, but more, a company that might be, say, a mid-market manufacturing company that's doing something and they have custom applications, but they haven't adopted these. I kind of love to hear kind of how that impacts adopting some of these technologies helps a company like that.
I think a lot of the areas that we see people kind of adopt this in those spaces are kind of like industrial IoT kind of applications. Yeah. Where we'll see, and what we call an edge gateway in a factory, and then that will, communicate with a group of sensors that kind of help measure the velocity of things, help catch anomalies, maybe have some, OpenCV set up so that it can see, like, has a little camera and say, oh, that thing's broken, whack it off the line. So there's a lot of applications kind of like that, and that's where the whole edge comes in, right? It's basically small devices talking to each other to give you a better understanding of the business, how it's actually working. Like another area with that is with trucking, right? So the trucks, they'll have a gateway inside of it. It'll have GPS. It'll have, temperature sensors if it's supposed to be cold storage stuff. And so it allows you to kind of surface that information to the people in the business making decisions, right? And help you understand, okay, well, whenever we've loaded up this truck on this route, it hasn't met this weight capacity. Why not? Can we shift the route and pick up more stuff along the way? Like, just having that amount of information is, I think, where Kubernetes kind of plays a key role, because there may have been little individual tools on the truck, and then you have to go download the information through like an ODB2 port or whatever. And now it's all connected in kind of an IoT sense. And so you have these individual devices measuring individual things, and it just allows you to get that much more, frankly, metrics and understanding of what is actually happening in the business versus before. You can kind of piece things together a little bit one at a time, but now you have all of this information coming up all at once. You can get a single pane of glass of here's what's happening everywhere in my business, and here's what we can do better, basically.
And that concept of a single pane of glass, and not gaining that through leveraging a Kubernetes deployment, I think that really, talk about like business value, I think that resonates with a lot of customers. I mean, hear that in just about every type of systems infrastructure conversation we have at Celigo. We're in the middle of a lot of those that not necessarily as many IoT, but more about core like transactional business processes. But it seems like there's so many people out there in industry kind of searching and yearning to get that holy grail of that single pane of glass. It seems like it's a continual search. We're getting closer and closer.
It's interesting when I hear you say that, Mark. I was doing a deep dive on your LinkedIn, Chris, and one of the first things that I noticed under your SUSE section, or whatever you call it, is you work to tear down silos to share tools, processes, and information across different organizations. And when I saw that, well, first of all, it just sounds a lot like what we're talking about, this clear pane of glass with information coming in from all places, regardless of what org or tool. But it's also something that at Celigo, that is kind of our bread and butter, is tearing down business silos, connecting people's tech stack, and allowing information to flow freely between them to be as efficient as possible. And I know SUSE and Celigo are two completely different companies, but I'm curious, just like, like, does that resonate with you? That kind of, I don't want to say like integration and automation, because those are the key words that we use all the time, but does that kind of resonate with what you were saying previously about a flat pane of glass?
It does, in a way, yeah. I think a lot of like that specific bullet point on my LinkedIn is a lot more of kind of organizational, cultural, more than technical, in the sense of, hey, we're all working on these little bits of automation to do, say the K3S RK2 release process. Let's set up a repo, let's have somebody own it, and kind of collate all of these tools and turn them into one suite of tools that does everything that we need. I think, a lot of the silos were more, again, organizational, around the fact that we were a recent acquisition in SUSE. And so we were kind of separated from everybody else. And so it's kind of breaking down the communication barriers and opening up, to, hey, SUSE QA team, here's what we're doing. Here's what you're doing. Maybe we can work together and do the same thing once instead of like 4 different ways. So that's kind of where I like to focus, is automation, in the sense of, putting in automated guardrails around the process. Like, again, talking about the release process, right? There was a lot to be desired when we first started with it. And that's obviously how it goes, right? You just get stuff out, and then you kind of go back and try to make sure that, you formalize and make the process as efficient as possible. And so, a lot of it is just a collection of small, tiny tools that, once you put them together, turn into one, automated process. I push for that as well at Canonical, in terms of, how can we share like tooling across a bunch of different organizations that were kind of doing things their own way. And there's obviously a lot of different ways to do it, but the way that I've always done it is just kind of break down communication silos and just go talk to other teams and see what they're doing. And have we already solved this problem? If so, let's work together to, reuse what we already did.
That makes sense. Seems like, Mark, you've probably heard that hundreds of times talking to our customers and potential customers, that, that openness and communication and need to connect is probably pretty relevant in their software tech stack.
Oh, definitely. I mean, the need to connect, the need to improve processes, regardless of what they are, whether it's a release process within a development team, or it's an order to cash process. in your business. I mean, we see this pattern repeated in business, literally of all sizes. I mean, it's so much of, I think, modern, building a modern business and evolving it is about continually refining those processes. I see it, Chris, you mentioned kind of this, almost what I think of as a continual improvement to those processes. Like, hey, you got to get it out and do it, but then you're always making it better. You're always kind of working to break down. And this is something that I've seen a lot in businesses, that this is for those that come from a background of that, they're like, well, yeah, that's what you're always doing. And it seems really obvious to a lot of us, but I've also seen a lot of businesses really struggle with that in their growth phase, that they sort of look at things and be like, oh, we're gonna do this project and we're gonna design this new way of doing it. And it's sort of this big bang approach to everything, that they go and they do it and then they launch it and now it's new. And then it's like, well, this is it, it's done. And I know, coming from a lot of time in an ERP background, I spent a lot of time explaining, hey, when we launch this thing, that's just the beginning. Like, this is just the beginning of the process, because you've got to settle in for 60, 90 days. And then the real work begins, figuring out how to tune it and how to make it better in any of these systems, whether it's an ERP, it's a development process, it's a piece of custom software that you create. It's like thinking of it as a continual evolution, that it's always evolving, that whatever your cycle is going to be, that you're going to revisit this, whether it's a 2-week sprint cycle or it's something else, whatever you have resources for, that you're always making it a little bit better at every turn. And that, I think, is really transformative, whether it's a process or a thing that you're building. And that's what's really stuck with me, because it applies really to literally everything, whether it's highly technical or actually if it's really non-technical, it's over in accounting somewhere, but it applies in both, like all of the paradigms, I think, really well.
Absolutely. And that's one of my key focuses just in general in management, is how can we do things a little bit better each time, right? Yeah. And one of the things that I found as managers is sometimes tricky is, when you're managing a bunch of devs, sometimes they want to go off and make a whole new thing that's better based on what they already learned. And then sometimes you have to rein them in a little bit and be like, hey, okay, we have a pretty good start here. Let's iterate on it. Let's improve it a little bit each time. And then, it's kind of, again, like the whole, don't let perfect be the enemy of good, right? Like, you have a starting point, great, use it and then build off of it. Don't just keep restarting the starting to build something new.
It's interesting how CI/CD is baked into so many different businesses, and it doesn't matter if you're an engineering or development company or a manufacturing company. It's something that I think all of us pretty clearly recognize is completely necessary for any business to improve. I want to ask a quick question. I know you mentioned Rancher earlier. There's Longhorn, there's Rancher Desktop. SUSE has a whole bunch of open source projects, and I was kind of introduced to open source 4 or 5 years ago. I'm obviously not a developer, but the company that I worked at the time had a lot to do with open source, and we're putting out their own open source products. It's something that I've been pretty interested in and relatively passionate about over the years. And I'm curious, beyond helping people, do cool things, via development, what's like the value or importance to you of open source, and how does it play into the greater picture at SUSE?
So I have a very, I am very privileged in that I've spent my entire career in open source. I've never done anything closed source. It's basically, for SUSE in general, like, it's in our DNA. Everything we do is open. We're going and spending $10 million to fork RHEL to keep it open, right? Like, it's baked into what we do every day, and especially on my team. So it's a little bit interesting because K3S, K3S and RK2, obviously they're both open source. Everything Rancher does is open source. But K3S is very community focused, and it's, we donated it to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. We don't technically own it. The CNCF does. And so we're very community driven there. And, we really try to make sure that we take feedback and take pull requests and incorporate the community wherever we can, especially in K3S, like I said. And then RK2, still open source, built off of K3S, but it's a little bit more enterprisey. And so it's a lot more customer driven than community driven. But in terms of, being open source, it's everything. Like we want to do everything in the open because we think it gives you more flexibility. It actually gives you more security because you will have security folks that find your open source project and want to break it. It's a great way to, get people involved and figure out what people are actually doing with your software. Like we have discussions enabled on GitHub for K3S. We get to see a lot of these people come in and be like, hey, look at my, Raspberry Pi cluster running K3S. I'm like, oh, what are you doing with it? Oh, X, Y, and Z. That's the coolest thing ever, is seeing something that you help maintain actually powering something that somebody else is building.
That's really cool. I think the community aspect is something that there's certain companies that just do it correctly, especially in the open source world, whether it's SUSE, whether it's Grafana Labs, these companies that, to me, like, that is the coolest part, is seeing what people can build and what they can break, and getting ideas essentially for free from them because they love the project. And it's really cool that you work on the community side of things, and especially for me. I manage social media communities. You manage developer communities, and it's just interesting because I've been connected with you for quite a while on LinkedIn, and I've followed almost all of your updates, and it's interesting to see how much you care about the community, where you're posting K3S updates and K2S updates. Almost, I guess you have like a weekly post that you do, and I don't know. I guess this is kind of a crossover between social media and your role in engineering. But if you could talk a little more about, and I know you already touched on it, but I don't know. I'm very interested in the community side, so I'm struggling to come up with a specific question. But I guess I've
got a question on the community.
Right. No, thank you.
I'm really intrigued about this building community. This is something that I've been in part of lots of discussions about. How do you build developer community around something? And in our case, we don't have an open source product. It's a product that our product is a native cloud-based product, but it's not open source. And so I think it poses some more challenge. And I'm really curious to hear, Chris, what to you are the keys to building a really solid community? We'll start there, and then there's kind of some natural follow-up questions on the paradigm.
I was about to ask that.
So let's see. If to build a community, like a developer community around a specific project, the very first thing you need to do is just build something and put it out there, right? And ask for feedback, ask for ideas, ask for, hey, if we built this, would you use it? And if not, what if we did this? And it's all about communication, right? It's not like you can have very robust communities for a closed source project, as long as you have that openness and you go, seek feedback and seek people that want to learn more about it and show what they're building from it. And it's a lot of, soliciting feedback, trying to help. On the open source side specifically, of course, like trying to help build out new contributors and try to incentivize them to do so. And, just sometimes that includes or involves walking somebody through like a very simple PR process. Sometimes it's, making sure that you assign good first issue labels on an issue on GitHub that kind of allows people to go and filter and see, oh, okay, this is like a one-line fix. Even I can do that. And it's just constant fostering of communication between users and, people building things on top of your software. People just want to know about it. Like it is a lot of work just talking to people, right? Like I just can't stress enough that it's about the people more than anything, right?
That makes a lot of sense. And it always seems when you, as a an observer and sometimes a participator in different online communities, technical or otherwise, it always seems like there's a certain point where there's a critical mass that's reached, and then the content creation and the value of it, of the community as a whole, it increases exponentially from there. Do you think those the principles you were talking about of that openness and communication, does that really matter if you haven't reached, like, it sounds like that would hold true whether you've reached that critical mass or you have, but if you're still early, that is just as important or maybe more important early on?
I would say it's even more important early on, because it helps build up that trust between you and the community of, oh, they're actually listening. Like, they want to know what we have to say. I wasn't really here for the very early bits of K3S, but from what I've seen, it was a lot of, publicly saying, hey, we put out this thing, go play with it. Tell us how it breaks. We want to know. And just really kind of reaching out and talking to people about what they would want in a mini Kubernetes. Like, what would it look like if you had the perfect, Kubernetes that you could use on a Raspberry Pi? What would you do with it? What would it look like? And I think it's really kind of building up that trust, because if you go, you can be, so just by being open source, you're not necessarily building a community, right? Like the example that I hate to go for, but the example of that is Android, right? It's technically open source. Do they accept contributions to ASOP? No, not really. But you can go get the source after it's released. But so, it really is just that constant back and forth and building up that trust of, a new community member coming in knowing, okay, if I log a bug against K3S, it's going to get answered. It might not get fixed, but it'll at least be engaged like within a few hours, which is kind of crazy for that number of people. But my team is amazing and they do it. So it's just knowing, I will be spoken to with respect. People will take what I say seriously, and people will, try to take my feedback and improve upon it.
That makes a lot of sense. And one thing that really jumped out at me was that approach, that objective of your team to respond to something, to be so in tune that they're listening and responding to that feedback within hours. That it doesn't turn into days or weeks, but they're striving to being almost immediately responsive to the community if something comes up.
Yeah, I mean, we're pretty good at it. I mean, obviously there's cases where we don't do so great. And, there's always a little bit of a tricky spot when we do use Stalebot on GitHub, which closes issues after 180 days. We open it back up if anybody says this is still an issue. And we actually, we took a little bit of flack for enabling that. But in my personal opinion, it was helpful because it actually bubbles up older issues, right? So we'll have responded and then maybe, we didn't follow back up if somebody asked a follow-up question, a few weeks later. And so now it kind of pops up to the top. We're like, oh, okay, that's actually still an issue. We'll remove the label and make sure that it doesn't get closed. But, for the most part, we're pretty reactive to issues. I mean, especially for a project the size of K3S, right? Like we have 25,000 stars on GitHub and 80 something issues right now, which is not a ton for that many stars. Wow. Right? And that's a lot of it is, just good pruning and making sure that we close issues when they're closed. A lot of it is good triage. And then it's really just listening and fixing things when people tell us it's broken.
That's a really interesting way it's the right way to do business. It's you're taking care of the people that care about your product. You keep them engaged. You help them out. That's really cool. I'm curious if maybe SUSE in general or you in your personal life take inspiration from other, community-based organizations, whether that's GitHub, whether that's Reddit, Slack. Do you try to model certain things from other places and incorporate them into SUSE at all, or how does that work on your end of things?
So there's not really one model at SUSE. It's kind of up to the team. So even from a community standpoint, right? Like Longhorn is another CNCF project that SUSE runs. And that's a completely separate team for me that run things a little bit differently, still very well, I think. Like, I think they do a phenomenal job, but it's kind of up to the individual manager how they want to lead that specific community if they have that kind of project. I mean, we do take a lot of, I personally take a lot of inspiration from what I saw in the Ubuntu community that I was involved pretty heavily with. I've read books about community. I've just tried to take, any lessons that I can find from anybody else and try to incorporate it. But it kind of goes back to the, iterative approach that we were talking about before. Like, you try things, if it doesn't work, then you try something else. If you try it and it works and you think you can do it even better, then you do that. That's how the weekly report that you mentioned kind of came up. Like, I was bored one day, so I wrote a terrible bash script that pulled a bunch of stuff from GitHub. I was like, this is fun. So I started posting it, and people were like, oh, well, what if you actually showed this, this, and this? I was like, oh, okay, yeah, let's try it. And that's why those are up weekly now.
That's hilarious that you used a batch script to like automate that for your post from LinkedIn, where most people use like ChatGPT to write some goofy post, and you're using like complex technology to update people on community. I want to ask a slightly different question, and it actually has to do with your LinkedIn, because I find it really interesting that engineers and developers have they're in a dark cave coding all day, and the matrix green numbers are coming down the screen. And obviously I've met tons of engineers. They're all really nice people. They're not like that. You actually have windows, which is great. I'm glad you're not in a cave. But what value have you gotten from being like essentially a social butterfly in a way that most developers are not on social media, and specifically LinkedIn? Like, is that something that, you're really trying to grow your presence? Is that something that you're just trying to keep the community engaged on a different platform? Do you enjoy doing it? Like, what kind of started you sharing on LinkedIn? Because I noticed most developers don't do that.
I think the big push for me was to try to keep the community updated. I think, everything we do is open. You can go look at, any of the commits on GitHub. You can look at the pull requests that have merged. You can look at issues, you look at whatever. Mm-hmm. But I think I wanted people to understand how much work actually goes into just this single repo, which is one of many that actually get pulled into K3S. So honestly, I should probably update it to pull in a bunch of the component repos as well. But it's just, I find it fascinating, just the amount of work that goes into maintaining a project like this, especially for a Kubernetes distribution, right? So we released like 3 to 5 different minor versions a month. So we're constantly in a release cycle. And I don't think people realize that, right? Because you just download or you just use whatever version of Kubernetes is out that day, and you don't really think about it necessarily, right? But the way that it upstream works, we have to keep up with them. And so I like to highlight what the team is doing to try to give them credit for all of the great work that they're doing. And I try to do that for, both the dev and QA side, because obviously I came up as a QA person. I don't think QA people get enough credit. And so it's really, it's trying to spread out that credit to the team. It's trying to keep people on LinkedIn updated on what's actually, maybe there's a cool new feature coming in K3S and we want people to know about it. And then it really is just, trying to share for the most part.
That's awesome, man. It's a great way to another channel to build community. But I think you said, you're giving your employees and your team and your coworkers and, the credit that's deserved, because not everyone knows what goes on behind the scenes. And I mean, again, I'm a social media manager, so I'm all over that kind of stuff. And I think it's important. And I think the more, folks can do that, whether it's a CEO thanking their employees for the hard work this month, whether you're using a batch script to share all of the updates that your team is making, a sales manager congratulating an account executive on a huge deal that's closed. Those kinds of things they're really important for keeping an audience engaged, but they're also really important for employer branding and making your respective company appeal to, really high quality potential employees or future employees. And I'm a huge employee advocate, if you will, and I think you're doing a fantastic job. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you. I really feel like one of the key kind of components of being a people manager or an engineering manager is, like, I like to describe my management style as give credit and take blame, in the sense that I like to call people out publicly for when they do something good. And I like to tell everybody, like, hey, look at this cool thing that Brian did, or look at this cool thing that Brad did. And then, sometimes you mess up, and that's on me because it's my team. So if we introduce a regression in K3S, I'll post about it and say, hey, maybe don't use this version. We accidentally did this bug. That's on me. We'll fix it. But I think that's really something that's kind of lacking in some engineering management that I've seen. I think, it really has to be about building up the team around you, and not, you trying to go be like, look, this cool thing I did, when it's really you doing it.
Chris, I think you make a great point, but I'm going to argue it's not exclusive to engineering at all. It's simply good management. And I think in engineering, it's just even more apparent when it's bad. Like, it stands out to such a higher degree. But the principle and the concept of building that team that way, I think that's simply good leadership. And it's can be so painfully acute when it comes to engineering management, but it applies everywhere else in the same way.
That's a great way to put it. And I guess Mark will be making a LinkedIn post congratulating me for being a great podcast co-host later today. I'll keep an eye out for that one, Mark. Well, I know we're getting a little close to the end. We've been recording for almost 45 minutes. I don't want to take up too much of your time, Chris. I have my typical ending questions, but I want to leave the floor open for Mark to see if there's any topics he wanted to cover before we part ways.
I think we covered all the things that I wanted to make sure we touched on here, Jordan.
That's fantastic. Well, with that in mind, I would be remiss if I did not mention that Chris Wayne is also the number 4 most downloaded Kindle author on Amazon with his book, How to Not Be a Fatty. So I'm going to be downloading that because I could definitely use some tips, tricks, and best practices from Chris. So we know you're an author. We know you're a father and a family man. But for those listening who want to get to know you more, Chris, outside of work, outside of your family, what are you interested in? And obviously open source is one of these, but what are you interested in? What are you passionate about? What do you like to do for fun? We just want to let the people get to know you a little bit.
Yeah. Let's see. I mean, family is obviously the number one thing. Like, when I hang up here, I'm going to go try to play with my daughter, even though she's mad because she's teething. I think, one of the things that I like to do for me is, it's kind of goes along with the weight loss, but I exercise every day since like 2012. And it's it takes up a lot of the free time that I have, but I continue to do it because it's one of the best ways to clear your mind of what's going on. So I really like to run. Pre-COVID, I would do a lot of races across really the world. At my last job at Canonical, I used to travel 13, 14 times a year, and I would try to find a half marathon wherever I was traveling that month. So that was a really cool way to see new places. So like I did a half marathon in Taiwan, in Amsterdam, in South Africa, and then in Colorado, all in the same year for no reason whatsoever. So a lot of that, a lot of photography, and then it's really just playing with the kid and the dog and hanging out with my wife.
That's awesome, man. I love to hear that. You're a big I guess you like being outdoors. It seems like Mark's very similar. He's always trekking in the Alps or skiing through the forest or things like that. So it's kind of cool to see those connections. I just want to say, Chris, you've been a fantastic guest. I really appreciate you breaking down these very complex aspects of Kubernetes, of containers, of community building in a way that's really easy to understand. So again, thank you for being an amazing guest, and Mark, as usual, a fantastic co-host. To those of you who are still listening, thanks for joining us on the Celigo Technology Leaders podcast. We will see you in about a week or two. We have some fantastic guests lined up. We can't wait to see you then. So thank you so much, Chris.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. Great to meet you.
Bye, everybody.